In Nicaragua, the Mountain Gateway Church is the center of a prisoner swap with the United States. Massive estates, extravagant retreats, and 15-year prison sentences. Jonathan, could this be the plot of a gangster movie, or just a classic case of authoritarianism?
Well, it's no surprise that after many years of Sandinista rule in two sections from 1979 to 1990 and 2007 to the present, that Nicaragua has been slipping more and more towards totalitarian rule. The government is under the de facto dictatorship of Daniel Ortega, president from 1984 to 1990, and then 2007 to the present, with his wife, Rosario Murillo, vice president since 2017, and first lady every time that Daniel was also president. So this couple has got an iron lock on that government. The Hancocks from Texas are evangelical missionaries. In 2012, they founded the Mountain Gateway Church in, I think it was 15 rural towns in Nicaragua after getting government permission to do so. And the government in August 2024 passed a new law revoking all nonprofits' tax exemption status, including churches and religious organizations, which was the majority of them. So immediately the government was able to prosecute all the nonprofits under the anti-money laundering laws because of their, they had businesses to support their church and the rest of it. They did 1,600 in the first month, because this was August of this year to September. We're in September right now. It was August 22nd that the law was passed. So, and soon the Hancocks Church was targeted as well. Not right away, but like a month later, just recently, it was targeted as well. 11 of its pastors were arrested. Some were sentenced to 9 to 15 years for financial crimes. Many were released. I think it was 100 plus or minus that were released from all these organizations. And they were flown to Guatemala when the U.S. State Department intervened on their behalf. And in addition to that, that was after Hancock and a bunch of his supporters, petitioned the State Department to do something for their church members. So, but again, Mr. John Hancock and his wife Audrey and their son-in-law and daughter-in-law have been publicly accused of money laundering, but they were not in the country at the time. They were each fined $80 million, but were out of the country during the sweep. And so basically with the charges against them and the fines, it doesn't look like they can go back in country again as long as this regime is in power. So this story is from the New York Times by Francis Robles on September 5th, 2024. So
yeah, I think the most interesting thing there is money laundering. There's a lot of interesting things there. I see Kelly shaking his head. So Kelly, on that note, then what do you make of the money laundering charge? Bogus? Is it?
I don't
legit?
know. And I think that's probably one of the most important things we're looking at here. Whether the government is oppressive or not, did this church actually launder money? Mm-hmm. And they are running a coffee business down there as well. So, I mean, the potential for them to be doing something outside the book seems to be there. And let's face it, the United States has a history of doing bad things in Nicaragua, and we have a habit of doing bad things through private businesses, not through our government, but through organizations. So I have to really wonder what is actually going on here. On one side, you have a government that we can't trust. On the other side, you have people who may be criminals, so I don't know if we can trust them either. So I don't know what the real story is here. That's my problem. I'm having a really hard time understanding or believing either side.
Yeah. There's a very ambiguous approach here, isn't there? On the one hand, we have the government, and a spokesperson for the National Police of Nicaragua says that Mountain Gateway recruited peasants, seeking to make people believe they were helping the Nicaraguan people and spreading the word of God. But instead, the police claim that the pastors had dedicated themselves to acquiring vehicles, farms, houses, residential areas, doing business. On the other hand, we have the Alliance Defending Defending Freedom, and then the United States International Religious Freedom Commission. They say the government is jealous of sharing any kind of leadership. And so I think that there's probably some valid points to both of these things, because Kelly, you're right. And we have to look at the kind of colonial and imperialist, I think, natural point of view that maybe Americans have when it comes to South America and Central America, right? Mm-hmm. And yeah, coffee, tobacco, all types of sugar businesses. I mean, we ran rampant for a long time.
Roses. I mean, there's lots of businesses down there.
Yeah. And so is this just a kind of a more up-to-date scheme playing out? And I use that term, I guess, colloquially as well, because this is the church we're talking about after all. If they're not laundering money, they're running a grift. I mean, $80 million or $15 million properties or $5 million properties, whatever it was, whatever the case may be, they're not doing what they say they're going to be doing. So that's just my perspective on that, or at least what their religion professes, right? But this is not uncommon. So it kind of sounds to me like they're down there running what we would call a mega church or a TV evangelical scam up here in the United States. And the government of Nicaragua is saying, no, you can't do that. You're not going to milk that kind of money from our citizens. That's right. Go back to the United States and do it from them. That's kind of what I see happening here. But you can't really trust this government. So I'm having a hard time trying to figure out who's the good guy and who's the bad guy here. Jonathan, you had something.
Yeah, this is interesting because the church claims that the government was in on all their transactions and all their businesses. Every month they would be audited, and that the government was standing on their head the whole way. And so I start immediately thinking of what in the Middle East would be called bakshish, but which in South America is just greasing a palm with the authorities. They were very chummy with the national police. They let them operate when they were harassing the Catholic Church. They had already put a bishop in jail for 26 years for quote unquote money laundering and that sort of thing. It was actually for fomenting dissent. The Catholic Church was actively working against the regime. And so they were hammering the church. All the while they were letting this other church, so that Ortega wouldn't appear to be anti-religion. They invited, once they applied to come start their church there, he was all for it. And the government was, treating them well. The press was treating them well. They had their meetings. They had these mass meetings. And then they had a big meeting, and they spent lots of money on these meetings. And a lot of the poor people were going to it and that sort of thing. But the donations from the rich people in the country were also rolling in. So there was a lot of money being given to this church. And then what happened was, just before this law changed a couple of weeks ago, they had an event with 11 different areas where they bust people in. There were a couple 100,000 people attended this outdoor service in 11 different locations, including Managua. And one other thing the Ortegas is famous for, anybody who tries to have any more control of the people's thoughts there than them, and they take them down. And so immediately following this, you see this action. The law is passed, and then they all get in trouble. And they do a blanket one for all of this. They decided nonprofit charity organizations are just fomenting revolt and fomenting anti-government things. So they just kind of did a blanket, let's get rid of it. Yeah. And so they are, so I think that's kind of interesting, because I think there's guilt on the church's side as well. They had to know this was coming, because as people in those countries, the wealthy in those countries, get whiffed that they're making all the money, then they're going to put pressure on the government as well. This
was a case of the government, right? So the government getting a whiff that the church was making all the money, right? But and the church, obviously, it just can't challenge the power of a socialist regime like this, because the regime would fail if it loses its grip on society. And anybody that's got multi-property mega churches across the country is kind of building up an infrastructure to be able to do that. Kelly, right. Kelly, I see you smirking. Did you have something that you wanted to add to that? Because I actually do have another point that I want to discuss with you guys that we haven't brought up yet.
Okay, go ahead. I was just going to say, to me, like the way you're describing it, it sounds like a war to see who's going to win the hearts and minds of the people of Nicaragua, the
That's
socialist government, or
That's
the
exactly what it is. That's what got the Catholic Church in a problem because they were literally trying to foment a little bit of
I
dissent.
think it's like, I was talking to Mateo, one of our other nonprofits, and I thought this was maybe something interesting to bring up during this segment. But I remember him once telling me that the Catholic Church was really finding a hard time in Latin countries nowadays, possibly because they have ruled these Latin countries for so long and gotten them nowhere. So a lot of people who are in the Catholic Church are starting to turn to these more Protestant churches nowadays. Mm-hmm. And you said the Protestantism is like super on the rise while Catholicism is falling in Latin countries. And when I hear this, we put the Catholic bishop in jail and we got this Protestant church doing all this mega church trying to win the hearts and minds, I'm thinking that kind of falls into what Mateo was telling me.
So this is great because every time you guys keep talking, I think of a new point and I want to push the other point that I was going to talk about, because now we have to talk about the dichotomy of religion in the Western Hemisphere, because you're right, Kelly, the Catholics ran Central and South America for centuries, right? Mm-hmm. But and the overwhelmingly Protestant United States succeeded in the long run, completely put them in the shadows, right? And I think you're right. The Catholic Church is doing nothing to get us anywhere. So let's look to our neighbor to the north for the example. Maybe this Protestant work ethic that made the United States so successful is something that we might need to adopt. And that very much could be something that we see playing out here. On the other hand, though, and that's kind of a side note to what I really wanted to say, because on the other hand, we did see that this church was left alone for a little while longer than the other ones, right? Other people from these churches were getting jailed. Other people, they were getting fined. Things were being confiscated. And this church, who are we talking about? Mountain Gateway. That's it. The Mountain Gateway. All I can think of is the words that kept coming to mind was mega church. That's the only thing I can say. But Mountain Gateway, they came a little bit later. And so, Jonathan, I want to ask you, what do you make of the result being a prisoner swap with the United States? How does this American church fall into the realm of international politics? And does it make sense that they were left alone for so long, and then were ultimately used to get 100 political prisoners back?
I know it doesn't seem quite. It doesn't quite smell right, when you look at it that way. And again, they were lobbying the State Department and their representatives, and they're from Texas. If they wiggle a finger as a Protestant megachurch at one of the senators there, they shall remain nameless. Of course, they're going to go to the State Department and say, "You got to help these people out," and then or their representatives will, and you got to help them out. So do it. And then that's where the State Department says, "Okay, some of these preachers, are, it depends on whether they're American citizens or not," and all that got hashed out. And they said, "Okay, let's talk to Nicaragua and see if they're willing to give them to us." Nicaragua has been exporting a lot of these preachers down to farther south into, Honduras and other places, Guatemala, and ending their citizenship. So they're stateless people. So they can't come back to Nicaragua. They have no passport, because their citizenship has been revoked. And Ortega's been doing that a lot. So he's just exporting the problems to other countries, because he doesn't want to deal with it. He doesn't want to deal with people whose entire lives are built around convincing masses of people to follow them. And they don't like that. They want to be in absolute control of everybody's life. That's what totalitarianism is. Some people say they're sort of they're major league authoritarian, not quite totalitarian. And I sit there and I say, yeah, just apply the Bite model to politics, and you'll see there's very little difference between a totalitarian government and a religious cult. They still control your entire life, and that's what they want. They want absolute control so they can stay in power indefinitely.
So, Kelly, on that note, with these totalitarian actions being taken by the government, does the church have a place to complain? I mean, isn't this just a case of the church calling the pot? Excuse me, let me rephrase that. Is this not a case of the pot calling the kettle black by the church kind of pointing the finger at the government?
Yeah, I think so. I totally think so. And I totally think so. As you said, this is a battle to win the hearts and minds of the Nicaraguan people. And both sides are not being on the up and up here, it seems like. So I think it is the pot calling the kettle black. And I wonder too, like you were talking about maybe the Nicaraguans trying to replace that Catholic mindset with a more Protestant work ethic. I don't know if it's that so much as, and we've seen this in other parts of the world too, with American evangelical Protestants going around and creating wedge issues in other countries put themselves into that position of being the authority, right? We've seen it in Africa. We've seen them trying to do it in India. They've been really pushed back by the Hindutva there. I was just reading about that a couple of weeks ago, about how the Hindutva was coming down on Christians. And I have to really wonder if this crackdown on the Catholic Church, on this Protestant church, is just a crackdown on people from outside of our country who are coming in, who are taking advantage of the Nicaraguan people. How much of that money did Mountain Gateway take from Nicaraguan people and not give back to Nicaragua? And I think that's an important thing here. And maybe, maybe, and I could be totally wrong, but maybe the church was okay with the government for a while because they were paying the government to be okay. And maybe the government decided they wanted more money, or the church decided they weren't going to pay anymore. And all of a sudden now they're in trouble with the government. And I have to wonder if that something like that is going on.
I want to go back.
I am quite sure about some of that. I'm quite sure that there were bribes involved, because I have not been involved with any Latin American country that is not culturally okay with, well, not just culturally, but is not okay with low-level bribes, at least. But so it would not surprise me if there were even high-level bribes on that.
But would it surprise you, to Kelly's point, would it surprise you that the Ortega government actually did care that the Nicaraguan people were being ripped off? Or is this just a power struggle, right? Because
it's a power struggle.
Yeah,
they don't care. They'll take the money themselves, if they could. And that's what this is partially about, I'm sure, is that they get all the money and all the property and everything, and their businesses get confiscated for the government. So there is a financial component to this that is no small piece, so.
Yeah, and, I want to reemphasize what we are seeing with the decline of the Catholic Church. We've seen this play out before. The legitimacy of the Catholic Church and their challenging of governments, right? Because there was a point in Western history where the Catholic Church had the militaries, they had the money, and then the states got powerful, and then they got the money and they got the military, and they said, you know what? We want to make our own decisions. We don't need the church doing the very thing that we could better ourselves with by doing. Okay. And it rings true, I think, in this scenario where you have a government challenging a church over who gets to take more advantage of the people. And to Kelly's point, maybe the Ortegas are concerned that the church is taking advantage of the Nicaraguan people, because the Ortegas want to take advantage. The Ortegas, they don't want they have to protect the Nicaraguan people so they can exploit them.
They're getting the money I want.
Yeah, that's right. So very good points, gentlemen. On that note, I just want to ask, what does this being a heavily Catholic country, how does that affect what Ortega's actions were? I think we talked about that a little bit more, but doesn't Ortega, I would say, have an inclination to want to at least appear like he supports Christianity? What's with the breakdown there?
I don't think, I think Ortega has come out and said he was an atheist in public, but I'm not positive 100% on that. But
Okay.
he does have a, I mean, he was the head of the Sandinistas, which was a outwardly communist organization. So,
Yes.
so again, I'm not saying that I know for a fact he's an atheist, but I'm pretty sure he is. I do know that if I was a poor person living in Guatemala and I was watching a church steal money like that from my neighbors, I would want my government to do something about it.
Jonathan, any closing thoughts for you, sir?
Nicaragua has been a hotbed of things since the 80s. Actually, before that, the 70s was when the Sandinista
1920s.
revolution was going on.
Yeah.
And then before that, it was 1920s. And the only other comment I would say is all Latin American countries are Catholic, predominantly Catholic. So it's definitely an organization which wields an awful lot of political power down there. But countries like that go completely totalitarian either have courted the church or excoriated the church. So, but the church is still powerful amongst the poor people and the rest of the population. So I think a certain amount of caution is necessary. But again, if you have all the military, you can do what you want, so.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so with that, it's funny how we can take a story about a church having a conflict with the government and relate that to a much larger picture, right? There are some international relations at play. There's some history at play because the church has it goes way back and throughout its lifetime has been the biggest grift that we've ever seen.
Well,
right?
and honestly, the United States has not been nice to Nicaragua as well. And if you want to get an idea of what the Nicaraguan people might think of the United States, read War is a Racket by Colonel Smedley Butler, because he was a Marine who was sent to Nicaragua to oppress the Nicaraguan people back in the 1920s.
Yep.
And he wrote about how bad it was and what a horrible thing he was doing, not for his country, but for American corporations. So, I mean, there is a lot of history here, and there's a reason why Nicaraguans do not like Americans.
Yeah. Yeah. And, on that note, I was just about to wrap up the show, but I do want to make another point. It's something that we come across at the ACA a lot, and it's the problem of immigration, and people don't understand, how is immigration a religious issue? Well, look at what we're dealing with right now in this story. Look at the conflict between religion and government, and look at the amount of people that are fleeing oppressive regimes. Now, you might say, well, what does that have to do with the United States? For a century, the United States took complete advantage of these countries. And now I'm not trying to sound unpatriotic, but all practices have not always been the same. And in the 1920s and 30s, those practices were incredibly harsh. We exploited these countries so that we can better ourselves. And so I think we have a real case of the pot calling the kettle black if we have a problem with what Ortega is doing, because he's doing nothing but the same thing to these people, the church, who are taking the money from the Nicaraguans. And so, it's kind of all connected in that this conflict between religion and government, it's characteristic of grift. It's characteristic of, call it money laundering. I just call it, people pointing the finger at each other to try and make them the bad guy when they're all really kind of guilty of the same thing. In any case, guys, great discussion. I loved all the inputs. That really went down a road that we don't see too often. We don't talk about international relations enough, I don't think, on the nonprofits, but you heard it here, folks. And you can hear all kinds of other stuff by clicking one of the links below and checking out our other videos. Thanks for tuning in.